I was standing in my driveway, staring at the empty spot where 2 pallets of orange snow fencing materials had been sitting just that morning, when my neighbor Carl walked over with that look people get when they're about to deliver bad news they're secretly enjoying. "Your HOA president came by with a truck," Carl said, scratching his beard. "Took all that fencing you had stacked up, said something about unauthorized storage of construction materials visible from the street." I felt my jaw clench. My name is Stephen Sanders, and I'd lived in the Cascade Ridge community in Snoqualmie, Washington for 3 years without major incident. The HOA had always been particular about their rules, but this crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. Those materials weren't just random junk. They were specifically ordered snow fence supplies that I'd purchased to donate to the Washington State Department of Transportation for avalanche control work on Highway 2 near Stevens Pass. "Did she say where she was taking them?" I asked. "Nope. Just had 2 guys load everything onto a flatbed and drove off. Left this on your door." Carl handed me a bright yellow violation notice that had apparently blown off my front door and landed in his yard. The notice was dated that morning at 9:30, which meant they'd come by less than an hour after I'd left for work. It cited Section 14.3 of the HOA guidelines, which apparently prohibited storage of commercial building supplies, materials, or equipment in areas visible from public streets or neighboring properties for periods exceeding 24 hours. The fine was $250, and the notice stated that the offending materials had been removed and impounded pending compliance review. I pulled out my phone and called the number listed at the bottom of the notice. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. "Cascade Ridge HOA, this is Deborah speaking. This is Stephen Sanders from 4521 Evergreen Lane. Someone from the HOA just confiscated property from my driveway, and I need to know where it is and how I can get it back." "Oh, you're the snow fence violation. Hold on." I heard papers shuffling. "Yes, Mr. Sanders. The materials were removed this morning per violation notice 2025-147. The items are currently being stored at our management facility, pending your payment of the assessed fine and storage fees." Storage fees. Those materials were only there for 2 days, and they're needed for a state highway project. I have documentation from WSDOT confirming the delivery. "The covenant guidelines are quite clear, Mr. Sanders. No commercial materials visible from the street. If you had special circumstances, you should have filed for a variance at least 2 weeks prior to delivery." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. "I need those materials back today. They're scheduled to be picked up tomorrow morning by the Highway Department for avalanche control work. This isn't just about HOA rules. This is a safety issue." "Well, you should have thought about that before violating the covenants you agreed to when you purchased your home. The materials will be available for retrieval once you've paid the fine and storage fees in full. Storage is $50 per day. $50 per day. That's insane." "Those are the terms, Mr. Sanders. You can appeal the violation at the next board meeting on the 15th of next month, but the fine stands until the appeal is heard and decided upon. The 15th is 3 weeks away. I need those materials now. Then I suggest you pay the fine. Have a nice day, Mr. Sanders." She hung up. I stood there in my driveway, phone in hand, trying to process what had just happened. The snow fencing had cost me $1,200 of my own money. I'd purchased it specifically because Jim Martinez, a supervisor with WSDOT, had mentioned during a community meeting about avalanche safety that they were operating on a tight budget and could use help from residents. The fencing was critical for controlling snow drift patterns that contributed to avalanche risk along a particularly dangerous stretch of Highway 2. I called Jim immediately. He picked up on the first ring, and I could hear highway noise in the background. "Jim, it's Steven Sanders. We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The snow fencing I bought. My HOA seized it this morning. They're holding it at some storage facility and won't release it without a fine payment." There was a long pause. "You're kidding me." "I wish I was." They cited some covenant violation about storing commercial materials. I didn't even know it was an issue. "Steven, we need that fencing. We've got a crew scheduled to install it tomorrow morning before the next storm system comes through. The forecast is calling for heavy snow starting Thursday, and that section near milepost 74 is already showing signs of instability." "I know. That's why I'm calling. Can you help me with this? Maybe if WS. Contacts the HOA directly, they'll understand the urgency." "Let me make some calls. Send me the contact information for your HOA and any documentation you have about the seizure. I'll get our district administrator involved. This affects public safety, which trumps HOA covenants." I sent Jim all the information and headed inside to find my copy of the HOA covenant agreement. It was buried in a file box in my home office, a thick document I'd skimmed but never thoroughly read when I bought the house. I found section 14.3 and read it carefully. The language was indeed clear about commercial materials, but there was a subsection about exemptions for emergency services, public utility work, and government-authorized activities. I had a text message from WS. in my phone confirming the arrangement. I took screenshots and emailed them to both Jim and the HOA office. Then, I looked up the address for the HOA management facility. It was located in a small business park about 15 minutes away in North Bend. I decided to drive over there and try to reason with whoever was in charge. Maybe seeing the documentation in person would make a difference. The facility turned out to be a small office suite in a nondescript building. A sign on the door read, "Cascade Ridge Community Management, Brenda Morrison, President." I walked in to find a reception area with cheap furniture and motivational posters about community standards. A woman in her mid-50s with short blonde hair and glasses sat behind the desk, typing on a computer. She looked up when I entered. "Can I help you? I'm Steven Sanders. I'm here about the materials that were seized from my property this morning." Her expression shifted to something between annoyance and satisfaction. "Oh yes, the snow fence violation. You have payment." "I have documentation showing that those materials are part of a state highway department project for avalanche control. There's an exemption in section 14.3 subsection D for government-authorized activities. I'm familiar with the covenants, Mr. Sanders. That exemption applies to work being performed on HOA property for government purposes, not to private citizens storing commercial materials. But these aren't commercial materials. They're safety equipment that I purchased to donate to WS. They need them urgently for work that's scheduled to begin tomorrow." "That's very civic-minded of you, but it doesn't change the fact that you violated HOA guidelines. The materials were visible from the street. They were there for more than 24 hours, and you didn't file for a variance. The rules exist for a reason. Can I at least see them? Verify they're intact?" She hesitated, then stood up. "Follow me." We walked through a back door into a storage area that looked like a small warehouse. My snow fencing materials were stacked in the corner, still on their pallets, looking undamaged. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by renewed frustration. "They're fine," Brenda said. "We take care of seized property, but they stay here until the fine is paid." This is ridiculous. These materials are needed for public safety. People could die if avalanche control measures aren't in place before the next storm. Then you should have followed the rules, Mr. Sanders. I don't make these decisions lightly. The HOA board voted unanimously to enforce storage violations more strictly after we had several complaints about the neighborhood looking cluttered. Your violation was particularly egregious because the materials were clearly commercial in nature and were sitting right in your driveway where everyone could see them. For 2 days, and they were going to be picked up tomorrow. Nevertheless, she crossed her arms. The fine is $250 and storage is $50 per day starting tomorrow if you don't pick them up today. Cash, check, or credit card. I pulled out my phone and showed her the text from WS. Look, this is from the highway department. They're confirming that these materials are needed for avalanche control work. This is a legitimate government project. She barely glanced at it. That doesn't change anything. The violation occurred. The fine stands. You're seriously going to hold up a public safety project over an HOA fine? I'm seriously going to enforce the covenants that every homeowner in Cascade Ridge agreed to follow. If you don't like it, you can appeal at the next board meeting. In 3 weeks. The storm system hits in 3 days. Not my problem, Mr. Sanders. I wanted to argue further, but I could see it was pointless. Brenda Morrison had that particular brand of bureaucratic certainty that made compromise impossible. I took photos of the materials, documenting their location and condition, and left. Back in my truck, I called Jim again. This time he sounded stressed. I've been on the phone with our legal department and the district administrator. This is more complicated than I thought. Technically, the HOA has the right to enforce their covenants on private property. We can't just go in and take the materials. But you need them for public safety work. I know. We're exploring options. Our attorney is drafting a letter explaining the situation and requesting immediate release of the materials. We're also looking into whether we can classify the avalanche control work as an emergency service, which might give us more leverage. But honestly, Stephen, this could take days to sort out legally, and we don't have days. So what do we do? I hate to say this, but you might need to pay the fine just to get the materials released. We can reimburse you through our community partnership program, but it'll take a few weeks for the paperwork to go through. That's not the point. The point is this HOA is interfering with public safety over some petty rules enforcement. I agree completely. But right now, our priority is getting that fencing installed before Thursday. Can you pay the fine? I thought about it. $250 wasn't going to break me, but the principle of the thing made my blood boil. Still, if it meant the difference between having avalanche control measures in place or not, I didn't really have a choice. Yeah, I can pay it, but I'm not letting this go. Neither are we. Once we get through this immediate crisis, we're going to file a formal complaint about the HOA's interference with state highway safety operations. This sets a bad precedent. I drove back to the HOA office. Brenda was still at the desk. I pulled out my credit card without saying a word. Cash or credit? She asked, already pulling up the payment screen. Credit. She processed the payment, printed out a receipt, and handed me a release form. You can pick up the materials anytime before 5 p.m. today. After that, the office is closed and you'll have to wait until Monday. The highway department is picking them up tomorrow morning. Then you'll need to move them back to your property tonight. But Mr. Sanders, if you put them in your driveway again, it'll be another violation. You'll need to store them somewhere not visible from the street. They're being picked up at 7 a.m. tomorrow. They'll be there for a few hours at most. That's still technically a violation. I'd recommend having them picked up from here, or from your garage if you can fit them." My garage was full of my actual belongings, and there was no way 2 pallets of snow fencing were going to fit. "Fine. I'll have them picked up from here. Do you open early?" "The office opens at 8. The pickup is at 7. She shrugged. "Then you'll need to figure something out, Mr. Sanders. Those are our hours." I called Jim again and explained the situation. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Okay, we can adjust the pickup time. I'll have the crew swing by at 8:30 instead." "But Stephen, we're cutting it really close on the installation window. If anything else goes wrong, we might not get it done before the storm." "I understand. I'm sorry about all this. Not your fault. But this HOA president of yours is really something else." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the absurdity of the situation. I'd spent my own money to help with a public safety project, and I'd been fined and hassled for it. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. The next morning, I met Jim and his crew at the HOA office at 8:30. Brenda was there, watching through the window as we loaded the pallets onto a WS. truck. Jim came into the office with me to sign the release paperwork. "You must be the highway department supervisor," Brenda said to Jim. "That's right. Jim Martinez, WS. District 2. "Well, I hope you understand that we were just enforcing our community standards. Nothing personal." Jim's expression was stone-cold professional. "Madam, what you did yesterday delayed critical avalanche control work and put lives at risk. We'll be filing a formal complaint with the county about HOA interference with state highway safety operations. You might want to consult with an attorney." Brenda's face went pale. "That's not necessary. We were just following our covenants." "Your covenants don't override public safety law." What Mr. Sanders was doing falls under the category of supporting emergency preparedness operations. Your interference could be construed as obstruction. "I don't think you understand how HOAs work. And I don't think you understand how state highway regulations work. We're required by law to take all reasonable measures to prevent avalanche hazards on state routes. When a private citizen volunteers resources to help us meet that obligation, and a community organization interferes with that assistance, it becomes a legal matter." I'd never seen someone deflate quite like Brenda did in that moment. She handed over the release form without another word. Jim and I walked out, and I helped his crew secure the pallets on the truck. "That felt good," I admitted. She had it coming. "But seriously, Stephen, we are going to follow through with that complaint. This kind of thing can't happen. What if it had been actual WS. Equipment stored at a contractor's house? Or emergency response supplies? HOAs need to understand that public safety takes precedence." The crew drove off with the snow fencing, and I headed to work, thinking the whole mess was behind me. I was wrong. 3 days later, I received another notice from the HOA. This one informed me that I was being fined an additional $500 for antagonistic behavior toward HOA leadership and bringing outside entities into HOA business to harass board members. It also stated that I was being required to attend a disciplinary hearing at the next board meeting. I stared at the notice in disbelief. They were actually doubling down on this. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Her name was Patricia Chen, and she specialized in HOA disputes. After I explained the situation, she was quiet for a long moment. "Okay," she finally said. "First, that second fine is completely bogus. There's no provision in standard HOA covenants for fining residents for what they call antagonistic behavior. That's a First Amendment violation waiting to happen. Second, the highway department's involvement is a matter of public record now, which means this is about to get very public very quickly. Third, I want to see all your documentation." I sent her everything I had. She called me back an hour later. "Stephen, this is actually a pretty strong case. The HOA violated several principles of reasonable enforcement. They seized property without proper notice. They failed to consider legitimate exemptions in their own covenants. And now, they're retaliating against you for exercising your legal rights. I think we should fight this aggressively." "What does that mean?" "It means we're going to file a lawsuit against the HOA for improper seizure of property, violation of your covenant rights, and retaliation. We're also going to seek damages for the time and money you spent dealing with this mess. And we're going to ask for an injunction preventing them from pursuing this second fine." "Will that be expensive?" "Probably a few $1,000s in legal fees, but if we win, the HOA has to pay your attorney fees. It's in the covenants. And based on what I'm seeing here, we have a very good chance of winning. Let's do it." Patricia filed the lawsuit the next week. The reaction from the HOA was immediate and panicked. I received a phone call from Brenda Morrison the day after she was served with the papers. "Mr. Sanders, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We'd like to resolve this amicably. Really, because your last notice to me was adding fines and demanding I appear at a disciplinary hearing. That was before we fully understood the circumstances. The board has reviewed the situation, and we're willing to dismiss all fines and violations if you'll drop the lawsuit." "Not good enough. You interfered with a public safety project, seized my property improperly, and then tried to retaliate when I stood up for myself. This needs to be settled in court. Mr. Sanders, please. We're a small volunteer organization. We can't afford a lawsuit. You should have thought about that before you decided to play power games with highway safety equipment." She tried to negotiate further, but I told her all communication needed to go through my attorney. Patricia was thrilled. "They're scared," she said. "That's good. It means they know they messed up. Let's keep the pressure on." The lawsuit moved forward and something interesting happened. The local news picked up the story. A reporter named David Kim from a Seattle news station contacted me after seeing the court filings. I agreed to an interview. The segment aired on a Friday evening. It was a straightforward piece about a local homeowner trying to help with avalanche safety being fined and hassled by his HOA. Jim Martinez was interviewed, explaining the importance of community support for highway safety projects. Brenda Morrison declined to comment on camera, but they used a statement from the HOA's attorney saying they were confident in their position. The public response was overwhelming. The news station's social media posts about the story got thousands of comments, almost all of them critical of the HOA. People shared their own HOA horror stories. Local politicians started weighing in, with one county council member calling for reform of HOA enforcement practices. By Monday, the HOA was in full crisis mode. I received an email from their attorney requesting a settlement meeting. Patricia and I met with them the following Wednesday at a conference room in Bellevue. Brenda Morrison was there, along with two other board members I'd never met. Ronald Fletcher, an older man who looked deeply uncomfortable, and Susan Pritchard, a woman in her 40s who seemed angry about having to be there. Their attorney, a tired-looking man named Gary Woods, did most of the talking. "We're here to resolve this matter efficiently and fairly," Gary began. "The HOA is prepared to offer full dismissal of all fines, a written apology, and reimbursement of Mr. Sanders's out-of-pocket expenses related to the snow fencing purchase and storage." Patricia didn't miss a beat. "That's a start, but it doesn't address the improper seizure, the retaliation, or the harm to Mr. Sanders's reputation. We want full attorney fees, an additional payment for damages related to time and stress, and a formal policy change ensuring that materials related to government public safety projects are exempt from storage violations. Susan Pritchard spoke up. That's outrageous. We're already offering more than we have to. This lawsuit is frivolous. Frivolous. Patricia pulled out a folder. Let's talk about frivolous. Your board violated Section 14.3 subsection D of your own covenants by failing to recognize a government-authorized activity exemption. You seized property without adequate notice under Washington state law. You attempted to impose retaliatory fines that have no basis in your covenant documents. And you interfered with a state highway safety project, which could potentially be a criminal offense under state obstruction laws. Gary held up his hand. Let's not get carried away. Nobody is talking about criminal charges. Actually, a new voice said from the doorway, we are. Everyone turned. A woman in a business suit walked in, followed by Jim Martinez. She introduced herself as Angela Reeves, Assistant Attorney General for the state of Washington. I apologize for the dramatic entrance, Angela said, but this matter has come to our attention and we need to address it formally. The state has an interest in ensuring that public safety operations are not impeded by local organizations, including HOAs. What happened here represents a significant interference with highway safety measures. Brenda looked like she might faint. We didn't know. We were just enforcing our rules. Ignorance isn't a defense, Miss Morrison. The State Highway Department informed you of the nature and purpose of the materials in question. You were shown documentation. And yet you not only refused to release them, you attempted to levy additional fines and discipline Mr. Sanders for seeking help from appropriate authorities. What are you saying? Gary asked carefully. I'm saying the state is considering charges of obstruction of government operations. That's a gross misdemeanor in Washington, punishable by up to a year in jail and fines up to $5,000 for each person involved in the decision. The room went dead silent. Susan Pritchard looked at Brenda. You said this was routine enforcement. I thought it was. I didn't know we could be charged with a crime. Angela sat down at the table. Let me be clear about what we're looking for here. First, full restitution to Mr. Sanders, including all costs and fees. Second, a formal policy adopted by this HOA creating clear exemptions for government safety projects. Third, mandatory training for the HOA board on public safety law and proper enforcement procedures. Fourth, a public statement acknowledging the error and committing to better practices in the future. If we get all of that, the state will consider the matter resolved and decline to prosecute. And if we don't agree, Gary asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. Then we proceed with criminal charges, and the state files its own civil action for interference with highway safety operations. Either way, this story is already public, and it's not going away. The HOA's side of the table looked defeated. They asked for a private consultation, and Patricia, Angela, and I stepped out into the hallway. You didn't tell me the state was getting involved, I said to Angela. We weren't, initially. But after the news story ran, the governor's office started getting calls from concerned citizens. The Secretary of Transportation asked our office to look into it, and we realized this could set a very bad precedent if left unaddressed. HOAs can't be allowed to interfere with state safety operations. Thank you, I said. This whole thing has been insane. You did the right thing, Mr. Sanders. You tried to help with public safety, and you stood up for yourself when you were treated unfairly. That takes courage. We waited for about 20 minutes before being called back in. Gary looked resigned to whatever was coming. My clients have authorized me to accept the state's terms. Full restitution, policy changes, training, and a public statement. In exchange, we ask that the state decline prosecution and that Mr. Sanders's lawsuit be dismissed with prejudice once the terms are fulfilled. Patricia looked at me. I nodded. Agreed, she said, but we want specific timelines and verification processes. This isn't just going to disappear with a handshake. We spent the next 2 hours hammering out the details. The HOA would pay me $1,200 for the snow fencing materials, $3,000 for attorney fees, and $2,000 for damages. They would adopt a new policy within 30 days, specifically exempting government-authorized safety projects from storage restrictions. The entire board would complete a 4-hour training course on HOA law and public safety obligations within 60 days. And they would issue a public statement within 1 week, to be posted on their website and sent to all Cascade Ridge residents. Most importantly, Brenda Morrison would be resigning as HOA president, effective immediately. She didn't take that part well. That's not fair. I was just doing my job. Your job isn't to obstruct government safety operations, Angela said flatly. And frankly, Miss Morrison, if you don't resign voluntarily, the state will pursue charges against you personally. Your choice. Brenda signed the resignation letter. The public statement went out the following Tuesday. It was posted on the Cascade Ridge HOA website, sent to all residents via email, and provided to the news media. It read, "The Cascade Ridge Homeowners Association acknowledges serious errors in judgment regarding the temporary storage of snow fencing materials by resident Stephen Sanders in February 2025. The materials in question were purchased by Mr. Sanders to support Washington State Department of Transportation avalanche control operations on Highway 2, a matter of significant public safety importance. The HOA improperly seized these materials and failed to recognize exemptions in our own covenant documents for government-authorized safety activities. We sincerely apologize to Mr. Sanders for the hardship and expense this caused, and to WS. For any delays to their critical safety work. We have implemented new policies to ensure such errors do not occur in the future, and our board will undergo training on proper enforcement practices and public safety law. We are grateful to Mr. Sanders for his civic spirit in supporting avalanche safety efforts, and we encourage other residents to participate in community safety initiatives." It was signed by Ronald Fletcher, who had apparently been elected as the new acting president. The news station did a follow-up story, this time focusing on the resolution and the state's involvement. David Kim interviewed me again, and I made a point of thanking Jim Martinez and WS. For their support. "You think this will change how HOAs operate?" David asked me on camera. "I hope so. HOAs serve an important purpose in maintaining property values and community standards. But they can't become so focused on rules that they lose sight of common sense and public safety. If one good thing comes out of this mess, maybe it's that other HOAs will think twice before interfering with legitimate government projects." The snow fencing, meanwhile, had been successfully installed on Highway 2 before the storm system hit. Jim called me after the first major snowfall to tell me it was working exactly as intended, controlling drift patterns and reducing avalanche risk. "You did a good thing, Stephen," he said. "Despite all the headaches, would you want more help from residents in the future? Or is it too much hassle?" "Are you kidding? We need all the help we can get. Budget cuts mean we're always stretched thin. Community support is crucial. We just need to make sure people know their rights and have documentation in place beforehand." That gave me an idea. I contacted a few neighbors who'd expressed interest in helping with highway safety initiatives, and we formed an informal group called Cascade Community Response. We worked with WS. To identify needs and coordinate volunteer efforts, always making sure we had proper documentation and authorization for anything we did. I also filed for a formal variance with the HOA before any future deliveries of materials, just to be safe. The HOA, for their part, seemed chastened by the experience. Ronald Fletcher proved to be a much more reasonable president than Brenda had been. He reached out to me personally a few weeks after everything was settled. "I want you to know that not everyone on the board supported how that situation was handled," he told me over coffee at a local shop. "Susan and I both thought Brenda was being too aggressive, but she had a way of steamrolling over objections. Why didn't you speak up? Honestly. I didn't think it would escalate like it did. I thought you'd just pay the fine and move on. By the time I realized how serious it was, the situation had already spiraled out of control. That's on me, and I apologize. I appreciate that, but you understand why I couldn't just let it go, right?" "Absolutely. You were right to fight back. Brenda had been getting more and more heavy-handed with enforcement, and nobody was willing to challenge her. Maybe this needed to happen to reset the board's priorities. What happened to her? Is she still in the community?" "She's still here, but she's keeping a low profile. I think the resignation was humiliating for her, and the news coverage didn't help. But between you and me, she brought it on herself. I ran into Brenda herself about a month later at the grocery store in North Bend. She saw me in the produce section and immediately turned to walk away, but I called out to her, 'Brenda, wait.' She stopped, looking cornered. 'What do you want?' 'Nothing. I just wanted to say that I hope you understand why I did what I did. You cost me my position and humiliated me publicly. You seized my property and interfered with a public safety project. I don't think I'm the bad guy here.' She was quiet for a moment, then said, 'I was just trying to enforce the rules. That's what the board wanted. That's what the residents wanted. The residents wanted their neighborhood to look nice. They didn't want you to stop people from helping with avalanche control. There's a difference between enforcing standards and abusing power. I never abused anything. I followed the covenants exactly as written. That's the problem, Brenda. You followed the letter of the law while completely ignoring the spirit of it. And when people tried to explain why that was wrong, you doubled down instead of listening. That's not leadership. That's authoritarianism." She looked angry, but also, for the first time, a little uncertain. "The covenants exist for a reason. Nobody's arguing against that. But every rule needs to be applied with common sense and consideration for circumstances. What I was doing wasn't hurting anyone. It was helping everyone. You couldn't see that because you were so focused on control." "I wasn't focused on control. I was focused on standards." "What's the difference?" She didn't have an answer for that. She just walked away, leaving her cart in the middle of the aisle. I felt a little bad for her, honestly. She'd clearly believed she was doing the right thing, enforcing rules that existed for good reasons. But she'd lost perspective somewhere along the way, and it had cost her. The winter passed without further incident. The avalanche control measures on Highway 2 performed well, and there were no major incidents despite heavy snowfall. In March, WS. sent me a certificate of appreciation for my contribution to highway safety. Jim Martinez presented it to me at a small ceremony at the district office in Wenatchee. "We don't do this often," Jim said, "but your efforts went above and beyond, especially given the obstacles you faced. You represent the kind of community partnership that makes our work possible." There were about a dozen other people receiving certificates for various contributions, and afterward, we all went out for dinner. I met a woman named Olivia Owens, who had donated winter emergency supplies that WS. distributed to stranded motorists during storms. We ended up talking for over an hour about community safety initiatives and the challenges of working with local bureaucracies. "I can't believe your HOA actually sees the materials," she said. "That's next-level ridiculous." It was pretty surreal. But it ended up bringing attention to an important issue. HOAs need to understand that they can't interfere with public safety operations. Have other HOAs changed their policies because of what happened to you? I've heard from a few people in other communities saying their HOAs adopted similar exemptions after hearing about my situation. So yeah, I think it's having an impact. Good. The last thing we need is petty bureaucrats getting in the way of people trying to help. Olivia and I stayed in touch after that. She was involved with several community organizations and knew a lot about navigating local government systems. We ended up collaborating on a proposal to King County about creating a formal volunteer coordination program for emergency response and highway safety support. The county was receptive, and by summer, they'd implemented a registry system that allowed volunteers to get pre-approved for various types of assistance activities. The HOA training that was mandated as part of the settlement happened in April. Patricia Chen, my attorney, was one of the instructors, along with a representative from the State Attorney General's office and someone from WS. I wasn't required to attend, but I decided to sit in on it anyway. About 30 people from various HOAs in the region showed up. The training covered the legal limitations of HOA authority, proper enforcement procedures, exemptions for public safety activities, and conflict resolution strategies. Patricia used my case as an example of what not to do, walking through each mistake the Cascade Ridge HOA board had made. The fundamental error, she explained, was prioritizing rules over reason. Yes, covenants exist for good reasons. Yes, enforcement is important for maintaining community standards, but every situation requires judgment and consideration of context. When Mr. Sanders explained what the materials were for and showed documentation from WS. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the HOA president chose to escalate, leading to legal consequences that cost the association thousands of dollars and damaged its reputation. Susan Pritchard, the board member who'd been at the settlement meeting, raised her hand. In hindsight, it's easy to say we should have handled it differently, but in the moment, we were just trying to enforce our covenants consistently. Consistent enforcement doesn't mean inflexible enforcement, the Attorney General's representative said. It means applying rules fairly across similar situations. Mr. Sanders' situation wasn't similar to someone storing old furniture or construction debris. It was a temporary staging of materials for a government safety project. That context matters. Ronald Fletcher, the current HOA president, asked, "How can we avoid similar problems in the future?" "Communication," Patricia said. When you encounter a situation that seems unusual or potentially complicated, reach out and ask questions before taking enforcement action. If Mr. Sanders had received a phone call saying, "Hey, we noticed these materials in your driveway. Can you explain what they are for?" the entire situation could have been avoided. Instead, he came home to find his property seized and a fine notice on his door. The training lasted 4 hours, and by the end, most attendees seemed to have a better understanding of their responsibilities and limitations. Several people approached me afterward to apologize for what had happened and to thank me for pushing back. "You did all of us a favor," one HOA board member from Issaquah told me. "I'm embarrassed to say I might have done the same thing your HOA did if I hadn't heard about your case. Now I know better." Summer arrived, and life in Cascade Ridge returned to normal. The HOA operated more smoothly under Ronald's leadership, and enforcement actions became less frequent and more reasonable. I continued working with WSDOT and the county on community safety initiatives. And Olivia and I developed plans for a winter emergency preparedness program that would train volunteers to assist during severe weather events. In August, I received a letter from the state attorney general's office informing me that they were using my case as the basis for proposed legislation clarifying HOA authority and establishing specific protections for residents supporting government public safety activities. The bill would require HOAs to recognize exemptions for emergency services, public utility work, and authorized safety projects, and would impose penalties on HOAs that interfered with such activities. Your willingness to fight back against overreach has led to meaningful reform, the letter stated. We appreciate your civic engagement and your commitment to public safety. The bill was introduced in the state legislature in September and attracted bipartisan support. Several legislators contacted me for testimony and background information. I spent a day in Olympia providing a deposition about my experience, which would be used to support the legislation. By October, the bill had passed both chambers and was signed into law by the governor. The new statute, officially titled the Community Safety Support Act, established clear guidelines for HOA treatment of residents engaged in authorized public safety activities. It also created a formal complaint process and empowered the Attorney General's office to investigate and prosecute HOAs that violated the law. The governor mentioned my case specifically in her signing statement. Stephen Sanders did what every good citizen should do. He saw a need in his community and took action to help. When he was punished for that civic spirit, he stood up for himself and for the principle that HOAs cannot override public safety. This legislation ensures that future volunteers won't face the same obstacles. The story came full circle in December, when the first major winter storm of the season hit the Cascades. Highway 2 remained open throughout the event, with minimal disruption, thanks in part to the avalanche control measures I'd helped support nearly a year earlier. Jim Martinez called me during the storm. Just wanted to let you know the fencing is doing its job. Drifts are forming exactly where we want them, away from the critical slide zones. The crew said to tell you thanks. That's what it was all about, I said. Making sure people stay safe on the highway. You know, we've had half a dozen other volunteers come forward since your case got publicity. People offering equipment, materials, time. Your fight made a real difference, Stephen. Not just legally, but culturally. People feel empowered to help now. That meant more to me than any settlement or legislation. The whole point of what I'd done, from buying the snow fencing to fighting the HOA to working with the state on reforms, was to make it easier for ordinary people to contribute to their community's safety. If others were now stepping up because they'd seen what happened to me, then all the hassle had been worth it. I ran into Brenda Morrison one more time, in late December at a community holiday event. She was there with her husband, staying on the edges of the crowd, clearly uncomfortable. I thought about just letting her be, but something made me walk over. "Hello, Brenda." She looked surprised to see me. "Stephen, I didn't expect you to be here. I live here. It's my community too, I suppose it is." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been following the news about that new law, the one that came from your case. The Community Safety Support Act, yeah. Do you feel vindicated?" "That's not really the word I'd use. I feel like something good came out of a bad situation." That's about it. I've been asked to resign from the HOA entirely, not just as president but from the board altogether, Some residents are saying I'm a liability. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me felt sympathy for her. Part of me thought she'd brought it on herself. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know. Probably resign. I can't keep fighting everyone. But Stephen, I want you to know something. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I genuinely believed I was protecting our community's standards." "I know you did. That's what made it so frustrating. You had good intentions, but you let them override your judgment. I've learned from this. That probably doesn't matter to you, but it's true. It does matter. Nobody benefits if you just stay bitter and defensive. If you actually learned something, that's the best possible outcome." She seemed surprised by that. "You're more gracious than I expected." "I'm not trying to be gracious. I'm just tired of the conflict. What happened, happened. We all move forward from here." Brenda nodded slowly. "Well, for what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for the legal trouble, but for making your life harder when you were trying to do something good. Thank you. That means something." She walked away after that, and I didn't see her again that evening. I heard later that she did resign from the HOA board entirely, and that a younger couple had been elected to fill the vacant positions. The new board members were reportedly much more focused on community engagement and less on strict enforcement. As the year came to a close, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. It had started with such a simple thing: buying some snow fencing to help with avalanche control. I never could have imagined it would lead to legal battles, news coverage, state legislation, and a fundamental shift in how HOAs approached public safety issues in Washington. But that's often how change happens. Someone does something small and reasonable, encounters resistance that's unreasonable, and refuses to back down. The resistance reveals a larger problem, and addressing that problem creates ripples that spread far beyond the original incident. I was proud of what I'd accomplished, not because I'd won a legal fight or gotten money from a settlement, but because I'd stood up for a principle that mattered. Community members should be able to support public safety efforts without fear of petty retaliation from HOAs. That principle was now enshrined in state law, and it would protect countless other people in the years to come. On New Year's Eve, Olivia invited me to a party she was hosting. It was a gathering of various people involved in community safety and emergency preparedness work. Jim Martinez was there, along with Angela Reeves from the Attorney General's office, Patricia Chen, and about 20 others I'd met through my various projects over the past year. "I want to propose a toast," Olivia said as midnight approached. "To Stephen Sanders, who turned an HOA nightmare into a statewide victory for common sense and community spirit. And more importantly, to everyone here who gives their time and resources to keeping our communities safe. You're the real heroes." Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the champagne. This was what community was supposed to be about. Not enforcing petty rules or wielding small amounts of power over neighbors, but coming together to solve problems and support each other. As the countdown to midnight began, I thought about where I'd been a year ago. Just a regular guy living in his house, following the rules, not making waves. The snow fence incident had forced me out of that comfortable passivity and into active engagement with my community and its challenges. It hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when I'd wanted to just pay the fine and forget the whole thing. But I hadn't done that. I'd fought back, and in fighting back, I'd discovered something important about myself and about civic responsibility. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is refuse to accept injustice, even when that injustice is small and personal and would be easier to just tolerate. The new year arrived with cheers and celebration. I hugged Olivia, shook hands with Jim and Angela, and felt grateful for all the unexpected connections I'd made through this strange journey. What had started as a conflict with an overreaching HOA had become the foundation for meaningful community work and lasting friendships. In January, the Cascade Ridge HOA held its annual meeting. I attended, curious to see how the organization had evolved since the previous year's chaos. Ronald Fletcher ran the meeting efficiently, focusing on practical matters like landscaping budgets and snow removal contracts. There was no mention of violations or enforcement actions. During the open forum portion, a newer resident raised her hand. "I'd like to thank the board for the new policy on public safety exemptions. My husband is a volunteer firefighter, and it's good to know he won't get fined if he has to park his response vehicle in our driveway during emergencies." Ronald smiled. "That policy came about because of a situation last year that taught us all a valuable lesson. We're here to maintain community standards, not to interfere with people doing good work. I think we've found a better balance." After the meeting, several residents came up to talk to me. Most were supportive and curious about the volunteer coordination work I'd been doing. One older woman thanked me for standing up to the board. "Brenda Morrison needed to be taken down a peg," she said. "She was becoming insufferable. You did us all a favor." I didn't entirely agree with that framing. Brenda had been a problem, yes, but the real issue had been a system that allowed someone in her position to abuse their authority without checks or accountability. The reforms that had come from the incident were about fixing that system, not about punishing one person. Still, I accepted the thanks graciously and continued to work on building better relationships within the community. Cascade Ridge was my home, and I wanted it to be a place where people supported each other rather than fighting over regulations. The snow fencing remained in place on Highway 2, doing its job through another winter. Every time I drove past it on my way to Stevens Pass for skiing or hiking, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Those materials, which had caused so much trouble, were now saving lives by preventing avalanche hazards. That was what mattered in the end. By the time spring arrived again, my life had settled into a new normal. I continued volunteering with WSDOT and the County Emergency Management Office. Olivia and I had become close friends, and our winter preparedness program had trained over 100 volunteers. The HOA operated smoothly, with no more dramatic confrontations or legal battles. The story of the snow fence incident occasionally came up in conversations, usually as a cautionary tale, or an example of successful civic pushback against bureaucratic overreach. I was always happy to share what I'd learned from the experience, emphasizing the importance of documentation, legal support, and refusing to be intimidated by organizations that abuse their authority. One afternoon in April, I received a package at my door. Inside was a plaque from WSDOT, engraved with the text, "Stephen Sanders, Community Safety Champion. In recognition of exceptional dedication to highway safety and avalanche control operations, your contributions help keep Washington's roads safe for all travelers." I hung it in my home office, next to the certificate of appreciation from the previous year. They weren't symbols of defeating an HOA or winning a legal fight. They were reminders that ordinary people can make a real difference when they see a need and take action to address it, even when that action comes with unexpected complications. The snow fence incident taught me that standing up for what's right often requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to endure conflict. It taught me that rules and regulations need to be balanced with common sense and compassion. And it taught me that even small acts of civic engagement can have far-reaching consequences when combined with principled resistance to injustice. More than anything, it taught me the value of community in its truest sense, not as a set of covenants and restrictions enforced by bureaucrats, but as a network of people working together to solve problems and support each other. That's the kind of community I wanted to live in. And thanks to everything that had happened, Cascade Ridge was becoming more like that every day. The saga that began with 2 pallets of orange snow fencing in my driveway had transformed my relationship with my community, my understanding of civic responsibility, and my appreciation for the courage it takes to challenge authority when necessary. I wouldn't have chosen to go through all the stress and conflict, but I couldn't regret the outcome. Lives were safer, laws were better, and communities across Washington were treating volunteers with the respect they deserved. And somewhere up on Highway 2, snow fence materials continued their quiet work of controlling drifts and preventing avalanches, a lasting testament to the idea that when good people refuse to accept unreasonable obstacles, positive change becomes possible.